I'm sure it's going to be screened at some point. And they, typical of Punch Drunk, which is part of the whole kind of aesthetic of how you hold an audience, an immersive audience in durational events, as part of their method is that everything is really meticulously made. Everything is really carefully grounded in making. And so they wanted the text, if you imagine a relatively remote community that's been telling and retelling a biblical story, Chinese whisper style, until it starts to become a bit strange. So they wanted this rewritten for this particular live screening. So I did. Handwrote all the pages for the Bible that they recite from in the live stream at the Stations of the Cross, through which they drag poor old Jude Law, who was a very, very tired man at the end of this. So this is one of the photos from my screen I took at the time, because you couldn't even screenshot it effectively, which was incredible. Don't know how they do that. Anyway, so you can find me here if you want to, or otherwise just rock up on email. What is immersive experience? So I hope you'll be delighted to know that I don't consider it to be limited to VR or AR or any of the technologies that wrap the audiences physically in a designed environment. I think of it in terms of an experience that audiences may have when they are absorbed in, committed to, or intensely engaged with an experience. And it's not, I propose, not something that happens to. It's not something that you do to audiences. It's something that audiences commit to. You can issue an invitation. They may respond by suspending disbelief, which is an active act. The way I got to this point was through spending a probably disproportionate amount of time involving myself with Punch Drunk's work on productions, talking to makers. I mean, I could have stood up. Obviously, I had the chief stars of the company on tap, as it were. But I wanted to interview people who touched the interface, as it were. So I talked to lots of makers of different types, people who interacted directly with audiences. I talked with naive audiences predominantly, and tried to elicit what the wow was. And it turns out audiences very much willingly give themselves up for immersion rather than it being anything that happens to them. So we can look there at the idea of capture, which Ray Chow writes about very intelligently. I write about it at length in my book that Julie kindly plugged. And we also have Claire Bishop writing about self-abduction and self-exploitation in theatre performance and arts more broadly, where audiences and even participants sort of self-exploit, they self-invest, they self-abduct. And the act of doing so, this commitment, is of perpetual interest to me and to designers of particularly durational immersive experiences. A wow may not last very long, but how do you get the wow to last 3 hours? How do you get it to last 12 hours? And that was what was so amazing with the third day. So we're not talking about something that is new in itself, although the terminology immersive experience is relatively new. The idea of immersion, we find that coming in from the 1980s onward. So we have, God, suddenly my name brain, of course, absolutely conks out on me. I'm going to have to revert to my book, but from the 1980s, we see people talking about immersive experience. Prior to that, we have, I mean, from all the way from the caves of Lascaux to the sorting offices in which Punch Drunk did their latest performance in London, via Gothic churches, via the early modern sort of whimsical experiences designed in in gardens of royalty and so forth, via the music hall experiences, which was, from what I can tell from historical records, it's all pretty scratch and sniff. So the medium changes obviously through time, but the nature of presentation, the nature of this experience in audiences, and sorry, that was the wildlife treading on my mouse, which I'm also now going to have to hide. The nature of the experiences and the intent of the designer to create something that takes your breath away, as it were, certainly does not appear to be new in the slightest. So the site and the medium in which the site is realized may vary. What I would again propose is that how we think the audiences effectively when designing for immersive experience is critical. And as somebody who's worked with live audiences at scale, and in many communications with other people who design and work with live audiences at scale, we tend to gravitate towards thinking the audience as a fluid, as a dynamic fluid. The individual ceases to be in focus, as it were, for your design intent. And instead, we think of the flows, the velocity, the volatility, the heat, the pressure, or if things don't really work out, or if you're wanting actually to shut things down and go home, we might talk about ebbs. So the whole imagery around fluid reinserts itself again and again in teams of people who work with live audiences. And that's one strain of research that I'm very interested in taking forward, of how we can effectively model thinking audiences for virtual dimensions as well, rather than thinking in terms of stereotypes or thin slice demographics and all the usual tools of the trade. More about that later, perhaps. So when designing for immersive experience, you have to create the invitation. You have to convince or suggest to the audience that you're going to hold them, that their commitment, that their suspension of disbelief is going to be rewarded with mutual commitment from your side. And this again is something that I elicited from interview materials, primarily audiences, but also experienced designers. If you're going to keep an audience engaged and continuously, unfoldingly, emergently suspending their disbelief, you have to communicate your continued support and mutual commitment across the interface to them. And the way this occurs in the work that I've been studying the closest is through this detail attention, the investment of absolutely passionate dedication to detail, to creating every single aspect of the what you might call the interface, which could be scenography, it could be an interface in the traditional sense, or it could be objects that are held and manipulated by your audience. They need to communicate that commitment from the designer, because audiences notice the difference very quickly. And this cannot really be overstated, the fact that audiences really do notice when you fully commit and when you don't. And there's very little room for error. So here is one of the slightly grainy screenshots by camera from the third day, which is an example of this extreme commitment. Method acting, I guess, yeah, to an extreme sort in an extreme sort of way. So Jude Law lived this for these 12 hours in the mud, in the cold, dragging this boat across pebbles and land with this rope. And he was apparently, from interview materials, I haven't interviewed him myself, the exhaustion, the tears, the absolute desolation of the site was engendered completely genuine and authentic feeling and emotion in himself, which indeed communicated across the interface. So this is broadcast to thousands and thousands of people. I monitored how it was received on Twitter at the same time, and I think one tweet in particular captured the nature of the engagement quite well. Somebody said, I was just gonna check in and see what it was like, but turns out this is what I'm doing today. So you were, in fact, although you had every reason not to sit and look at the, I mean, this scene here was half an hour. Not much happened. Really not much happened. The wind moved, the clouds moved, the water moved, the actors got steadily more exhausted, but really there wasn't much in the way of action. But it was riveting. It was genuinely riveting, because that commitment and just that sense of knowing how cold it was, knowing how exposed they were, knowing how exhausted they were, and somehow perceiving that held us there in our thousands. And yes, of course, a little while after this, they both fall in the water, which was, this is October. It wasn't late October. It's not warm. We're really not talking warm here. And yeah, I won't spoil the drama, but it was, reasonably dramatic in an extremely drawn out manner. So this compact that keeps audiences and designers in a kind of, I guess, a mutual dance, a mutual commitment across the interface, depends on this continued solicitation, this continued offering into the trust that entices and supports the audience's willingness to play. You need to trust the audience, and you need to honor that trust. And I think we hopefully have a knowledge in between us of examples where that show this to be true. I certainly do, from having worked with companies like this around at the back end. The commitment is there. It is unequivocal, and that is sort of the magic, actually. And that trust, of course, involves trusting the sounding box of the audience's imagination, because that ultimately is the space in which immersion as an experience occurs. The physical scenography for it, or the virtual scenography, or the book pages, or whatever it is that stimulates that sense of immersion inside the sounding box of the audience, then their hearts and minds, that is the location for immersion. And these kinds of qualities, trust and that commitment to support that location that you cannot fully control, that cannot be overstated, really, the importance of that. So here we have Secret Cinema. This is Blade Runner. So this is Indoors Rain. I went there. It had quite a few dates. I think they ran it not every day for a month, but there was a number of dates. Very impressive set. Not my absolute favorite of their productions, but it was very good. And the Indoors Rain was fantastic. Again, Secret Cinema is a huge organization, and they employ slightly, obviously they have a core cast, but they also have quite a lot of people who come and go. They have a slightly faster turnaround on productions than Punch Drunk. And sometimes it works out really well, and sometimes, yeah, you can kind of see where the illusion holds and areas of the sets when it doesn't. So some of my favorites involve Miller's Crossing and The Shawshank Redemption. I'm going to just show some examples. I've got them up on screen if I can find them. I'm just going to check here, which am I on? Yes, I'm on here. Let's go to Chrome. Chrome. Here we go. Fantastic. We have traction. So Miller's Crossing was absolutely stunning. You entered via a supposedly Chinese laundry.
It's about character.
Came out into a speakeasy, into this world here in London.
You'll come and find the... You think I'm some guinea fish off the boat and you can kick me, but I'm too big for that now. I'm sick of taking a strap from you, Leo, and I'm sick of the hi-hat. For me.
Oops, sorry.
and have spaces to gather for mysteries and ideas to grow. Let your imagination drive culture forth, let it run wild. So we got ourselves a little secret here. As far as you're concerned, the mink was never here, you were never here. You gotta keep it on a QT, very hush-hush, and you tell no one.
So that's the kind of, it's obviously quite hammy, but that's sort of part of their things. It's in a different mode than say Punch Drunk, which isn't hammy. That's a bit more traditional, cough up a piece of lung sort of performance. Punch Drunk is tongue-in-cheek. Secret Cinema is tongue-in-cheek. And it very much the appeal is that they totally trust the audience to dress up to the nines and do this. But the architecture is fantastic. What they did with that space, some sort of council building that they took over, they're just absolutely immaculate. So their work on scenography is absolutely top notch. It's entertainment rather than art, I would say, but you know, they're very very popular, and rightly so, I would say. I think rightly so. They have earned their accolades along with others who in this genre. So I'm going to just move on to what I do think is the high point of their particular output. This was absolutely rocked, the Shawshank Redemption, because you had you were essentially a prisoner. You had to strip off, and you had to wear long underwear, because they took your stuff and put you in a prison uniform. So these are all audiences. And then they put you in a cell. Hit any audience members, obviously, but
if I didn't care,
that was literally the food they served as well.
Carried out without notice. Any contraband found will result in punishment.
If I didn't care, would I feel this way? If this isn't love, then why do I thrill?
So we all played along and sung these songs and rioted. So and just to top it off, in the middle of because they always screen the film towards the end, and at that point when they're tarring that roof and they're sharing a beer, a cold beer appears, passed down the line where you're sitting in the auditorium. So suddenly you just get this cold beer in your hand, and the coordination of that's my favorite production of theirs, and none of the others really come close, I think, personally. But that was extraordinary, and the fact that they strip you down to long johns and a top and put you in prison fatigues and basically have hundreds of people acted out was nothing short of really, really well done. Oh yeah, I should say that you get to ride in the 1930s bus as well, and you go to court and you get a sentence and you get told in no uncertain terms what your new identity as a prisoner is before you're transported to the London school that they turned into this prison. So yeah, really impressive, very, very immersive indeed. So yes, sustaining immersive experience. You articulate your intent and capability to sustain and support ongoing suspension of disbelief through your own commitment to the designed experience. So this is not a direct quote as such, but this ultimately seems to be the magic juice from what I can tell in my research. The image in the background is a life-size model of a dead horse. So it's not actually a dead horse, but it is a life-size model of a dead horse that is unbelievably faithful to life. And it featured in one of the Easter egg one-to-ones in The Drowned Man that I didn't even know about. I worked on site for several months and I didn't know they designed this, because the interesting thing is that not everyone who designs knows the entire production. It's so vast. So 500 people was involved in work in this production over the year that it sort of ran from beginning to end. And they had a one experience that was in a basement in a part of the building I didn't know existed, where they had a very dramatic scene involving this particular dead horse model. So that left quite a big impression on me. Anyway, I may be very excitable, but I also have dedicated myself to a number of these kinds of experiences. So I don't think I'm very, very easily conned as such. So that was good stuff. Generally speaking, the text should not be the star in the ensemble. When you have to fuss with interaction, when you have to fuss with details, when it doesn't flow, that doesn't work. That doesn't work. You can expect your audience to make very significant effort when it comes to playing, to suspending disbelief, to moving into character, to come dressed, to come prepared, to commit in a lot of ways. But you need to walk the walk your end as well. If you use tech, make sure it doesn't actually scream unless it's part of the narrative. Your focus needs to be the creation of encounters, scenes of dissensus, from Rancière, at the scale that is relevant to your design scheme. So here it might be worth talking a little bit about the sort of thing that Punch Drunk can do now. Certainly in lockdown, they're designing miniature experiences that people can do with their families in their homes. If you go to their website, you can find them for free. For a little while. If any of you went to Pete Higgins' talk recently at BU, they've also designed a little package for classrooms called Small Wonders, where literally a shoebox, like the size of a shoebox, with a set of little miniature props and a storybook that a teacher can develop with their class over, say, a week. So they do tiny things as well as very big things, and they do one-to-ones, and they do 600 audiences. So scale is important, and you obviously need to scale the dissensus that you are thinking about accordingly. And what does really remain a constant is that attention to detail. So returning a little bit to the audience and how you think them, don't make the mistake of thinking that you know them. There is a great tendency, I think, especially in software design, where, you know, agent-based modeling and how that tends to translate is to think the audience is a little cookie cutter figure who's meant to kind of do what you designed for them to do. And the agent aspect of it tends to be realized through the idea of demographic fine slicing, to put a boring term on it, trying to understand your audience through their past habits, or an approximation of their past habits based on aggregated data sets from millions and millions of interactions by people who somehow fall or are placed in a similar demographic category. Now, it stands to reason that this is a reductive way of thinking your audience. You're thinking them not only do you reduce them to a data point, you also reduce them to what they've done in the past. Whereas effective thinking as the designer concerns what they may become. And based on working with live audiences at scale, and based on working with people who work with live audiences at scale for very long periods of time, including Sleep No More, which is on its 10th year, 400 people a night, New York, Shanghai. We think audiences as a dynamic fluid in terms of their agency. What can they do? What might they do? Both desirable and undesirable actions, and how you may accommodate and negotiate either of those. Because audiences are not predictable. If you can, they're a force, they're a dynamic force. You're dealing sort of with an element rather than a collection of individuals. A crowd is not an individual multiplied, and an individual is not a crowd subdivided. An individual, if you're going to design for a person, or if you're going to create a present for somebody you know well, for example, that model of a person is actually ontologically different to what a crowd is when you design for them at scale. And the closest equivalent I can think of, and that I've come across in any of the people I know who work with this, is actually to think of them as a dynamic fluid. So I'm currently in discussion with an oceanographer to look at how we might leverage dynamic fluid modeling as a way to think our audiences in virtual terms for digital design. All this is extremely embryonic, so don't quote me on it. Here's just a little shot on the kind of the craft side of designing books. This is from the Punch Drunk set. It's very craft. It's very makey, touchy, feely, trying things out. It's just this layered intensity of detail, this layered making that goes into everything. We're designing for encounters, not preformed assumptions about what will take place. The books that you saw there are little stories, little flip book stories in books that are stuck in a bookcase somewhere on set. These sets are huge. So over 100 fully realized rooms, 170 fully realized rooms. Some of them have bookcases full of books. Some of those books have little flip books, little stories, drawings, bags standing around with clues, miniature narratives. The text is layered into the entire scenography at all levels, from the miniature to the macro scale, in terms of how the building is subdivided and laid out as a labyrinth, as a story labyrinth, if you will. So text is actually everywhere. I am interested in the infrastructure of immersive experience as a text in and of itself, a text that invites the extension of trust and the expansion of the sounding box of the imagination in the audience, and the sense of unknown potential to create that space in which audiences may experience immersion. And if we design for the idea that we know the audiences, we will fail, because they come to be surprised by themselves as well as us. So it really is quite critical that we think audiences in terms of their potential for shape-shifting. So on the subject of unfussy design, here we got Eliasson at the Tate. So we have his mist rainbow installation, which is really open to, it was crowded all the time. I went there several times. Children, adults, everyone is equally delighted. You move your position in the room, you change a little bit, you photograph it, you look it. There are new things to see all the time. You get rainbows appearing, beautiful light effects, the feeling of the moisture on your skin, just really lovely, very easy to interact with, as evidenced by the constant attention by audiences to this particular work. This is from Secret Cinema's Moulin Rouge, where they built an entire village indoors. It was huge. This is an audience member who's brought an accordion, because why not? When you invest this level of passion in designing the interface, audiences respond. They won't do as much as you, but you set the ceiling for how much they will invest. There's just a little quirky installation in a festival in Graz in Austria that I was fortunate enough to go to before lockdown. So this is a festival that its HQ is inside an entire building of tunnels and caves called Schlossberg. And there's a lift that goes up and down, and they've just got this beautiful little installation. Very quirky. I was stuck there far too long. I think I went up and down 5 times a night. It was very lovely. It's me and my red phone. Yeah, I am a little child internally, so obviously. So there are music venues in caves, and beautiful lighting throughout, and that sort of thing. Yeah, we went just up and down. Had great fun. And an underground railway, of course, a miniature underground railway, because why not? I thoroughly recommend visiting Schlossberg. Sorry, there. Here's another example from Lumiere in Durham, one of the first Lumiere's festival, if not the first. In Durham Cathedral, which is obviously a very spectacular scenography in itself. So a French group suspended hundreds of these singlets in the vast dark space of Durham Cathedral with a single candle inside them. And so it looked like they were floating, these kind of vests, white vests illuminated from inside. It doesn't sound like much, but it was immensely moving. That first Lumiere was incredible. Again, very unfussy, but I mean, significant investment. And the sense of space, the sense of, yeah, just very exhilarating, very good at working with live audiences. So as a material, audience agency, again, thought of as a dynamic fluid, especially useful when designing for large audiences or crowds. So what are the implications of thinking audiences not as agents, but in terms of their agency as a material for the audience and for the designer? And if I don't rattle on for too long, we might be able to talk about that a little bit after I break up. So this is just a little, again, an example of unfussy design, the piano stairs on Odenplan in Stockholm. So people chose to walk the stairs rather than take the escalator because it played a little tune. An example of what people will do. So that's a very easy, unfussy example of immersive design. Audience agency as a material. So I'm working with colleagues at Sussex and King's College on a project that we're just waiting to hear from the HRC. We've been waiting for some time, but apparently they've lost access to their own main drives because of a data hacking event. XR3, XR cubed. So maybe if we're lucky, we'll get the money to do that. That should be fun. That'll be a continuation of Digital Ghost Hunt, which I did with the same people. We've expanded our team a bit to look at heritage buildings as technology, as experience machines. And we embed, we look into the heritage of the building and design a ghost story for it. So these are for young audiences and blended family audiences. And we use, we do use technology, but we use it as a kind of, as an incompetent ghost. We chose to invert the black box of technology, if you will, and invite children and their families into the black box, or the not so black box of technology, in the form of a mesh of architecture and technology, where they are the ones, the children, the participants are the ones who actually do the problem solving. The technology is a little bit kind of, yeah, a bit limited, a bit incompetent ghosts. Tragic End is something I'm developing with my lovely colleague Wendy at BU. Nimbus, which is a little agency I work with together with colleagues outside of the academy, and Merle. So this is a virtual village that exists in a multitude of stories at present, an interwoven story world that stretches across time and to some extent space, that we're building an application for the Arts Council for at the moment. As mentioned before, I have just said, yes, please, thank you, to work with Lyle on the Sustainable Storytelling Lab in some sort of little role. I hope that'd be lovely. And I'm very likely to continue looking at the stimulating problem of audiences as agency going forward. So that's something that bugs me. So I'm going to have to do something with it at some point. And why not? Audiences are a force of nature. So these are actually casts. They would have been audiences had the third day been the live event that it didn't end up. Well, it was, but it was just with a cast rather than randoms, as it were, audiences. These people are covered in mud from head to toe, and this particular dancing went on for a very long time. So it was strangely compelling, and this it just sort of illustrated the sense of a natural force of the audience. You could hardly tell the individuals because they were all so muddy, and there was just this rather ecstatic kind of abandon in music at the end of this exceptional ordeal that they dragged poor Jude Law through. Shameless plug, of course, that's my little book. I write about this in far more boring and technical terms in this book, which came out, well, actually, as we just said, it's going to respawn this year post. It's already out, actually, but yes. I think the library has it, otherwise Bloomsbury have it, and you can get hold of it the usual way you get hold of books. Maybe I shall now say, whoa, fantastic, 3/4 of an hour, and I haven't bored anyone to death yet, I hope. What are the consequences, everyone, for thinking audiences as agency?
From my perspective, it means you have to let go of your story. As someone who writes stories, this is the question I get asked a lot, which is, how can you stand it that someone might not experience the part of the story that's your favorite, or the element that you think is the best, or the ideal storyline? And I actually think that's amazing, and that's exciting that the audience can go their own way through a story. And I think there's an element to every narrative that has always been that way, right? We always kind of imagine certain things certain ways and that sort of thing. But the idea that you're actually co-creating the story with the audience is both terrifying and exhilarating. And I think that's really cool.
Mm. I mean, I'd say that it's surprising how it holds together and how willing the audience is to play along with you in ways that are agreeable to your understanding. But it does depend on whether the DNA of the story really does run through everything.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed that, Carina. I attended a session in London some years ago now. That was an immersive experience, basically as an art installation, had misted rooms, much like the one you described, but other ones that were not, had no path through it, but it was multiple rooms, probably 100 rooms or something, stitched together, and you could follow any path through it. And I think the contributors to it were all independent agents, but working to a theme. And so what it lacked compared with some of the things you were presenting was a narrative structure. There was no narrative at all. There were themes, and you saw recurring imagery rather spontaneously. But I wondered, how important do you think narrative is to this kind of work?
Totally. I mean, if you look at what I didn't show, it's the spreadsheets that hold their stories together, because they're not very pretty, but they are very big. So their entire story world is held together by spreadsheets, because it's not free for all. It's a story machine. It's like a clockwork.
Okay.
And the story sections, I think the idea of embedding text in every aspect of the scenography, and at so many different levels, from the minute accidental find through to the layout of the building, to found bits of text, narratives, crossing storylines. It's about the really intense processing of those stories as they are layered laboriously and with huge amounts of investment by designers, by scenographers, by the makers of the company. It's a very, very well thought through endeavor. And that's what holds it together. Because if you let 600 people loose in the dark for 3 hours to do pretty much what they want to do, there are ushers, right? And that's a very interesting, they're part of the story as well, in a very unique way that I do talk quite a lot about in my book. But it's certainly not, it's not about control, it's about narrative actually carries the entire experience. It's how you lay a narrative into the making of these kinds of architecture's thought here in the broadest sense, that makes it happen. And audiences are, provided that you go all the way, audiences are remarkably willing to play along.
Yeah. Okay, now that brings me on to the second question I wanted to ask you. You talked about the audience as having agency, as being an agent. And yet there is a strong script behind it, albeit a fragmented script that can be viewed from different directions.
Yep.
But that sort of takes away individual agencies if you're thinking of the audience as a collective rather than as individuals. And if you're orchestrating it to that extent, it's sort of paradoxical to think of it as a fluid, but having agency as well.
Absolutely. Yes, and yes, it is paradoxical.
Okay. Then I've understood, I guess.
It's a pragmatic point of view rather than anything else, because when you work with live audiences, let me tell you, they do
live
what they
audiences differ. I used to work in theater doing. I did for a rep company. I did repeated performances of the same show, and it was different every night because the audiences were different. The script was the same, the lighting and sound was the same, but the performance was different, and that's a very small scale kind of thing. But when you start orchestrating something like this, which is very much larger, then you're sort of detaching the audience from it, even while you're immersing them, aren't you? I mean,
I think
I can remember going to Cirque du Soleil and Les Miserables in great big theaters, and okay, the audience is sitting there; they're not walking through it, they're not making choices along the way, but they are immersive, but it's very guided and directed, and it didn't change from night to night. It was the same show.
Yeah, I'd agree with those. I would agree with those. That doesn't hold for the kind of events. Maybe it does for Secret Cinema, but it doesn't hold for Punch Drunk as such, because the story slowly changes. Or not the story, but the interface, the scenography, because audiences do some pretty intense things, and so they have to change whilst also maintaining the whole. So I would say that there's a very careful negotiation between what you can and what you should do. And so the role of the black masks, which is the ushers, they are key to that. They're sort of like the human part of the scenography. They're just completely in black. They're meant to be invisible, but they step in and they're trained to interact with the audiences. I mean, audiences do properly crazy stuff. They don't always do the stuff that you want them to do, and some things are okay and some things are not, like stealing part of the set and walking off. Not ideal, happens, but so they design some things to be stolen, and some things can be stolen and some things ideally shouldn't be. So there's a huge range. There isn't such a thing as in their productions isn't just like either or, control or freedom. It's actually It's taking that and opening it up into quite a wide band, and then making those, it's like an edge case, as it were, in and of its own right. And they look at that particular edge case where you feel your own agency in relation to the agency of, say, the scenography and the company. It's formulated to engender a sublime experience, because and there's some very interesting interview materials that goes into that. When people feel, they say, okay, I'm told to do what I wanted to do, and then I encounter, and then in those responses, designing those very responses is actually part of the process, and they give rise to some of the most pronounced sublime experiences that people have, where they feel like, whoa, and like, I thought it was just me in this thing, and then it's like, whoa, and then I felt I'm something much bigger, and I didn't know. And it's proper stagecraft, but not as we know it. But it's certainly a negotiation. I would describe it as a negotiation.
I'm conscious we've got 2 more hands up as
Yep.
well.
Shoot.
Bronwyn and Brad.
Yeah, you can leave Brad go first.
Okay. Go for it, Brad. You're muted, I'm afraid.
Okay, yeah. Well, I really enjoyed that idea of where you were talking about the difference between writing for a large audience and writing for an individual, and the idea of the large audience as sort of a dynamic fluid. And I was thinking how, having done a bit of both myself, and when you do the immersive theater, it's kind of situated somewhere in between. Like often people will talk about this narrative ludic sort of binary, but there's this, that's one of the things that's really interesting about immersive theater, is it complicates that. And it's almost like different set of motives. So for instance, if I'm an individual navigating through some sort of space and I can make all the choices, it's much more about self-determination. If I'm an audience watching something up on the big screen, it's more a sense of, it's a more of a passive experience and I'm being transported by the experience. But if I'm in a room with a bunch of other people and we're creating it, co-creating it, it's like a flocking experience. It's like being a bird where you're influencing the movement and you're also being influenced by the movement, which is an interesting set of motivations, and we don't always think of ourselves in those terms. I was wondering if you could speak to, like, when you're designing something that sort of appeals to people, that aspect of human motivations.
Absolutely. I mean, we've talked, several of us have already touched upon the idea of sovereignty. And of course, sovereignty is a cherished thing that we have, but, you know, we have this idea of ourselves as sovereign and in control and individual and all that stuff. And, you know, the whole Cartesian la-di-da. And this form of theatre does challenge that, both in the designer and the audience. Very on the nose, because you feel your dependency on others. You have, wow, you know, I'm part of something. Where do I end? Where does this begin? Where is my agency? Where is the agency of the environment? Where is the agency of others in relation to my own agency? And you get a really, really strong physical sense of it on both sides. And I would argue that it is that shared acknowledgement of limited control, the yielding of sovereignty, and the commitment to carrying on regardless. That actually is critical to that investment that carries people on both sides across. It actually connects rather than separates the designers and the audience, I would say.
Cool.
Bronwyn.
Okay, I can see there's another hand up, so I'll be quick. I'll just following on from Brad. I mean, when we talk about immersion in relation to reading, it's very different to the kind of immersion that you've just been talking about. And I would love to know, you know, is there any research on kind of more negative aspects of the experience from the audience point of view, that people that went to Secret Cinema or Punch Drunk and really hated it and maybe felt kind of bullied into participating? I'd love to know if there was research on that. Very interesting. I looked
a lot at, because it was very difficult to get hold of audiences who hated it. But if you go onto TripAdvisor, you can find that. So there's about 80% love it, 5 to 10% hate it. and there's like 5 to 10% in the middle that kind of goes, you know, very little, few people are middling.
Yeah.
And what really signifies those who hate it is the fact that they really don't like feeling confused. They really object to not being in control.
Mm-hmm.
Really object to it because they want to know what they want to know what's going to happen. They want to have us, and bear in mind that these are self-selected audiences, that you wouldn't impose this on people. The difference between play and terror is the fact that there's a boundary between the two. The play has a beginning and an end. It's got a door. You can go in and you can go out. You would not want to impose this on an audience that hasn't selected it, because that, you know, play turns into terror if you remove the boundary.
Sometimes you're there with a group of friends who persuaded you to come to the experience, and then you can't get out of it. So yeah, no, I think there's a project there looking maybe, you know, digging deep into some of those audience responses. But yeah, thanks.
Absolutely, and I've got 100,000 words of interview material if you're interested.
Okay, I'll take you up on that sometime.
Final question, I think, because I am conscious of
Yeah,
time.
sorry, yeah.
Yeah, please.
Hi, really fascinating talk. I wonder if I can convince you to have a short guest lecture in my new media innovation unit soon, coming media studies.
Sure, absolutely.
But some thoughts also following what Brad already raised, following up from that, made me think a lot. There is like those two notions, of course, on the individual level, that one needs this element of flow as an audience for gratification, that one needs the element of achievement and self-control. That's why computer games, which I'm not sure if computer games have been mentioned, which is a very immersive experience, and I think we can relate a lot there. But I also was thinking it from journalism and audiences. But finally, I was thinking it most of all from what Brett said with this dimension and what you said with the Cartesian system, how we're shaped, and especially the notion of control, which is very strong in Western philosophy. So looking at it from a more maybe transnational perspective, do you think on the one hand, the reception modalities might be different if you would go to a more communitarian or other oriented society, for example, where the self is not that extreme, but it's in relation, it's a more social self constructed, for example, in China, or would there be a reception modalities maybe different? Or on the other hand, is it a chance for Western societies to break up the very classic Cartesian notion of trying to control everything and just go with the flow? More philosophical.
They are running Sleep No More runs in Shanghai, so there's a project there. I have not traveled to China to interview Chinese audiences, but that can be done. Is control, the idea of control, entirely Western? I suspect it's not, but I do agree that there are different approaches to communality versus individuality. And I certainly think there would be very significant opportunities for research in that area. I'm very keen on the idea of it's being called ambiguity tolerance, it's being called a need for, relative need for cognitive closure, all those kinds of psychological labels that describe the spectrum of people, from those who need to know what's happening to those who can kind of cope with a bit of going on. I have found, and certainly in designing for and teaching design for non-linear production processes, non-linear kind of experiences, that a certain tolerance to confusion and just knowing how to cope when you don't know what's happening is actually a really valuable training ground. So yeah, I am really interested in these kinds of experiences as a kind of resilience gym for people, because if you let go of control, I mean, this is a safe scenario, right? Nobody's going to actually abduct you, and nobody's going to actually force you to do anything. It is entirely designed, and audiences know this. They know that they're not having a psychosis. They know the difference. They know that it's make-believe, and that is why they allow themselves to yield to this suspension of disbelief. That's what I say. The play and play theory, I don't know if you've come across that. There's the idea of there must be a boundary in time and space, or one or the other. that denotes the zone as a play zone, because otherwise, if you remove that, the difference between a hedonic experience and psychosis or terror, it's very fine, right? Can be in some extreme cases. So I think we need to think in terms of frames, we need to think in terms of boundaries, we need to think in terms of communality, dependency, sovereignty, and all those kinds of qualities when we discuss and critique these sorts of experiences. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. The social experience is really interesting in this regard, the social aspect of interaction, which is with immersion, what you presented there, the relation to other people and connection to other people. So thanks a lot. And if you don't mind, drop me
an email. I'm fairly approachable.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Carina, so much, and thank you everybody for coming along. We're slightly over time, so so we don't have to cope with more in our lives. I'm going to draw it to a close, but thank you so much for a really.
Thank you so much for being here. I didn't know what to expect.
It's just like the immersive experience.
Yay! Lyle, we'll talk more, right?
Yes, absolutely. Many talking and fangirling over various things.
Yeah. Best part.
Excellent.
And yes, Brad, excellent question. I have to say, the whole sovereignty thing is such an important thing. You talk a little bit about that.
Final
shameless plug.
Yes. Well, since I haven't had a launch, had I couldn't.
Timing is everything.
Well, I didn't plan the pandemic. Yeah, thank you so much.